We're here in your studio of Montrouge, which you've had for a year now. And to start with, I just have a question which comes from a sense of place. I mean, what does it mean to you to be a painter, an artist, and writer in Paris? I mean, what I mean is that you've worked all over the place, all over the world, and painted and printed in England and in the US. And why Paris?
Well, I've been coming to Paris since '68, so I feel a great attachment to French culture, and it has nourished me through the years, through my association with various artists and craftsmen, artisans, particularly Aldo Crumlink, the late Aldo Crumlink, who printed my etchings for 30 years. But also, I've gotten an extra push this year by having this studio. I've never had a space so sympathetic. It's just the right time for me in my 81st year to be able to move so freely in a space. I'm usually given to taking small, pokey places because of my agoraphobia. Now, claustrophobia is not what I have. I have agoraphobia. But this has just been grand. I've been able to, not absurdly, express myself in a big way.
Right, and
plus that the location and its proximity to Paris is a great convenience on the metro, but also people are very simpatico. My neighbors, everyone is friendly.
And in terms of what you were saying about your atelier and the scale, I mean, you've done large projects before, but your painting is moving towards abstraction. Is that a recent?
Well, that's funny that you say that, because 6 years ago it moved towards abstraction, or what I would call concrete painting. I dropped all the familiar icons of my life and just painted about paint. But you can't keep an old expressionist imagist down. So coming into my work now are the figure developments that I didn't ask for, but they grabbed me by the back of the neck and exist, and particularly using the abstract elements in conjunction with them. And also, I was influenced by a work I did 8 years ago for the Getty in Malibu. They asked me to react to the collection with a project, and I made an installation called The Poet Singing, The Flowering Sheets, based on a statue they have of someone from the cult of Orpheus and being influenced by the sirens behind him. And it was a very moving piece to me about this singer. So what's come back now is the poet singing in visual terms. Because when I made the installation, I made a huge, it's about 3 meter head tall of me in plaster, and along with wood, I carved wooden sirens based on Greek figures and over life size. And the poet is singing, it's me singing, and that's what I'm into now, you know, because it's time for me to write. There were times when I didn't. There were years from, say, 71 until, say, 93 that I didn't write at all. And I got it from Kyle Schlesinger. I got he sent me a review by someone called Heath or Health, or it's a long review, a lot about him, this guy. But it was also about me and how much he enjoyed the book. But he said, "What's the deal with Vincent Katz? Why didn't he tell us why he didn't write all those years?" Well, it was nobody's fucking business, you know? But now I am in, you know, since the middle 90s I've been writing, but now I'm really got my foot on the thing, particularly because of the performing last year, this past winter with you guys at Double Change and in Woolworths, where I've performed with the bass player Mark Marder, and I've written a few short poems, but mainly they're very, very long. And I'm in the midst of one right now. So, but that's what interests me. It's a long-winded answer to your question.
It's great, and it's beautiful. In the poem "Why I'm Not a Painter," O'Hara, you know, makes explicit why he is a poet and not a painter. And he's all very aware of the differences between, you know, writing letters on a page and drawing or painting colors on a canvas. But what's quite extraordinary in your case is that you're a painter, you're a printer, you're a sculptor, as well as a poet. And you've led all these artistic practices at the same time, even if you've stopped writing in the 70s and 80s for a while. But my question is, how do you see such practices, you know, writing, painting, printing, articulating in your life, and how are they related one to another, if they're related?
Well, they're related in the most basic way because they're all done by me. It's the same guy, and I don't even change hats, you know. Some things it's appropriate to paint about, and some things it's appropriate to write about. That's the only way I can say that. I mean, there are certain things, although through the years, there has been a history in my painting where I've used words on the canvas.
Right.
You know, and in fact, I've been tempted recently to put some words on the canvas, but it could be thought of as a cheap trick because it can make the canvas work in a certain level that maybe I should stay with the discipline of painting in a way without putting the word on, or not. I'll have to see. But as far as putting words down on a page, I do that in printing anyway, you know, a lot of times. I mean, I've done, I think, 3 portraits of Diana where they include poems.
Right.
And the realistic portraits.
Right. But I was going back to what you were saying about words in painting. I mean, that's quite fascinating. For instance, about the car crash series that you did in 1960. You said that you've always been excited by putting words in your art, which you said was a very 20th century idea. And you said that you've always trusted words in the painting and in prints. And it's kind of interesting to see, or I'm even also thinking about your Flaubert, your homage to Flaubert, where you're writing words. And as you just said, there's ways then in which the image or the painting is working in different ways.
As we know now, I mean, in the 21st century and what happened in the 20th, I could write a poem out on the canvas, right. And I would, well, I actually have. There is a very long painting I made about 1990 called, I think it's called Death to the Defiant Miners. But it's all about, it's just a bunch of phrases, but it's painted, and I've written them out. So anything can be a painting. And not absurdly, I don't think anything can be a poem, you know? But anything can be a painting. I mean, on my door in the studio, it's a huge autobiography of the last winter. Names of things I have to do, don't forget your keys, blah, blah, blah. You could make a poem of it, you know?
When you said that not everything can become a poem, when does something become a poem, according to you? I mean, how do you know that you've written a poem?
For me, it becomes a poem when it relates when it sounds like something I would like to hear from my voice.
Is that, you know, I'm thinking about what you said, again, going back to the Flaubert homage, and you have this beautiful expression in the book, Jim Dine, printmaker, where you talk about merging with literature, and which is beautiful. And is that, how do you feel about that merging? I mean,
well, I've been punished for it critically.
really?
In painting. See, the two big complaints about my work all these years, 60 years, has been, one, he's too European, whatever the fuck that means, and also I'm too literate, you know, I'm too much involved with literature, not enough visual stuff. I don't know what they're talking about, you know.
Right.
So I don't think it makes any difference. I mean, whatever. I mean, why is education sentimental any different than pears and apples? And
Right.
you know,
Right. And
it's always something to paint about. There's always something.
yeah. And in Vincent Katz's brilliant introduction to your collected poems, he writes that much of your oeuvre as a visual artist can be described as poetry if we use a definition of poetry as taking one thing and make it into something else. And could you say more about this concept? I mean, first of all, do you agree with Vincent? And could you say more about this conception of your entire oeuvre as being poetry?
I don't understand the definition
Right.
that he gives. I guess you could say I mean, it's like John Cage might have said, well, first I took one thing and then you add something else to it, and then you add another thing to it, and it's all, therefore, that's what the dance is, or that's what the art is.
Right.
But no, if my paintings are poetic in some way, it's because the painter is a poet.
Right. And it's in his, still in his introduction to your collected poems, Vincent notes that the subtitle to your first book, which was published in 1969 by Trigram Press, Welcome Home, Lovebirds. So the subtitle is Poems and Drawings, and Vincent insists on what he calls the crossover quality that defines your outlook toward the arts and life. And do you think that this crossover quality is what you've been punished for, as you said?
Yes.
The fact that
Yes.
you're moving between
Yes.
worlds that
Yes.
are not...
And I've been more comfortable knowing poets than painters.
Right.
I've been more comfortable. There is a kind of American painter who, it's like rubbing your nails on a blackboard. They grate on me, where it's a kind of cowboy macho painter that I never was interested in, you know? And I think, yeah, just that. I mean, if the truth be told, I made that book, Welcome Home Lovebirds, Poems and Drawings, because that was kind of what Asa Benvenisti asked for. Because I was not known as a poet, I was known as a painter. If he was going to sell the book, he needed the drawings. Let's face it. I mean, he was a realistic guy too.
Right, right. It's the old Thibaut de Nage story, you know, about
Yeah.
you know, bringing in the poets and the painters together. Just moving back to your writing poetry, some of your poems have been written on walls, as you said.
Well, that's how I do it.
Right.
That's been my method sometimes, depending where I am, is to write on the wall and then correct that way. Because of my dyslexia, I can see better when it's big.
Right.
And then I can correct the way I would correct a painting, by whiting out, for instance, a word.
Is that writing poems on a wall, does that give you, I mean, it becomes a physical experience, and it's very different from writing at a desk,
right,
on a notebook. What's the sense of it for you?
Well, it's a big physical challenge, and I've just finished redoing this installation, the poet singing Flowering Sheets in Basel, in Switzerland, at the Antiquities Museum. They gave me a room. So I wrote the whole poem with my three assistants on the wall again. And this time we really got into it because all of us exchanged our own calligraphy. So we'd go to one stanza and then they'd come to another one, and then somebody else would do that, and I'd come in and correct it, or by correcting I mean make it mine more than their handwriting. And I was able then to edit the poem. I would take out a word, I put in a word, I saw a word that looked like another word, and I thought that was a better word. So I'd rub out, it was all done in charcoal. So there was a kind of penimento, a visual penimento, and a poetic one in the poem this time, and it was very much alive. And it's interesting, I was just thinking, to get this thing, to make this installation, I had to bring the statues, the big wooden sculptures and the big plaster head from Walla Walla in Washington State, where I live. I built a house for the installation. So I've left the poem there on the walls. And Diana said, well, what are we going to do? It's going to be so sad. I said, it's not so sad. She said, well, maybe I'll move my desk in there and just write amongst, and use it as, you know, that's the decoration of the wall. And it's absolutely true. It could be I think I'll go back this summer, when I go back in a week and a half, and maybe add to it, or rub out. I've never used fixative on it, so I can use my hand and a rag, come in with new things, and you get the word coming through that was underneath. That excites me. It's like your intuition. It's like your unconscious before you. Your unconscious becoming material.
It's quite fascinating that you said that you were working collectively with your assistants, because you were working both on the shape of letters and also on the word choice, because you were sometimes...
Well, the word choice was mine.
Right.
They wouldn't have the nerve to put their own words in, because I'd rub it out immediately. But the calligraphic choice, I allowed them to make, and then I would correct, and sometimes theirs was better than mine, or sometimes I took a grinder to the wall, and sometimes I threw Diet Coke at the wall and let it run over the charcoal, and it gave a kind of patina.
Right.
And so it was a great active collaboration, I thought.
Right. What happens then when the poem is transcribed from the wall onto the page? Vincent explains in the volume that Kyle Schlesinger published that they've tried to keep some elements of typography by using capital letters, and by trying to, within the means of printing, traditional printing, that tried to keep some of the sense of the material aspects of the poem. But for you, what happens when the poem is transcribed from the wall onto the page? Is it a loss, or?
It's a loss.
Right.
You lose the liveliness.
Right.
This year I made a font.
Right.
From my own kind of Frankensteinian handwriting with ink brush. And Steidl printed out the font for me. And we made the House of Words, this installation of the poems coming down on throwaway paper. And it was very alive, I thought, and much more alive than reading it on a page. But And people responded by taking the things, taking away the poems. You could have a poem, you know? And particularly, I think it was enhanced by the fact, not that I'm a great reader necessarily, but I was reading amongst it. So that for the viewer and the audience and they were not just listening to the poet singing, they saw what the poet had put together. Right. It was a kind of complete story of my life.
Right. It's true that when we did the show as well at EOF, where we had your poems on the first floor hanging, and then you were reading and performing with Martyr, it's true that it was poetry actually becoming alive, and almost you were talking about the poet singing, almost in an Orphic sense.
Yes, it was in an Orphic sense.
And is that a tradition, sort of the lyrical or Orphic tradition that as a writer you're interested in?
Yes. I'm interested in those people. I once said to Ron Padgett, I really don't like Ginsberg's poems. He said, look, he said, because he never says bad, anything really bad about anybody. He said, look, when he reads, it's angelic. He said, that's all you want. And it's true. When I heard Ginsberg read, I couldn't believe it, that he brought it to life. Stuff that I felt was an affectation when on the page became, I understood, which was presumptuous of me to say it was an affectation. But I felt it, and I was embarrassed sometimes by it, what he had used. But when he said it, I heard him give a reading of, what was it called, Kansas City Sutra? Something like that, anti-war poem. At Cornell, when I was teaching there in the mid-60s, it was magical, I thought. And also Bob Creeley, when he read, it was just like Creeley was, like that, take it or leave it. He said, this is me. And also the effect of his Boston lower class accent, which he cultivated, this old Havardian, it was great. He spoke like my aunt. I had an aunt from Boston the same way.
And to go back to the show that was at AF, one of the impressions that I got as someone seeing the show was that moving among the poems hanging from the ceiling was almost a physical way to experience the poems as well, recreating
And I felt it was like the poems coming up to you and how you doing? Glad you're here.
That's great. You were talking about dyslexia, and I was wondering, going back, and we're moving into your writing practice here, but I was wondering if dyslexia had been a way for you to challenge, syntax in your writing. I mean,
no, it wasn't dyslexia that did it. It was my anarchic attitude towards education. So I read what I wanted to read. I interpreted it the way I wanted to interpret it. I did nothing in school. I learned nothing in school, nothing, and was unable to for a variety of reasons, not the least of which was dyslexia, but also psychological problems as a teenager. I had lost my mother when I was 12, and I was obsessed with death, and could not concentrate in class. So I might as well not gone to school. I should have been in some vocational apprentice to a carpenter or something. That would have been better. And so my syntax is the way I speak. And if someone doesn't like it, it's too fucking bad, That's the way I speak. Because I always thought that you can get your voice in there. It's really very important.
Right.
Very important. Right. I mean, when you read certain poems, that are published in the New York Review of Books or New Yorker, let's say, you realize, why do you need, it's not alive.
Right.
They're like dead.
Right. When did you start reading poetry?
I started in my 20s, early 20s, because I couldn't sit still and read a book for the same reasons. I was into painting and I had to do it. I was hyperactive. I would have been probably medicated as a child had I been in the age of medication. I medicated myself with alcohol. So it was the same thing. I calmed down. But I couldn't sit still to read a novel. And so I started first to read poetry. And then when I found Creeley and Kenneth Koch and O'Hara, when I found them, just by, I loved, and I still do, love going to bookstores and standing up. I usually read the thing backwards. I start at the back page. It's what I do, And when I found these guys, I thought, it's possible to speak like this, not to speak like Pound necessarily, or not to speak like Alfred Lord Tennyson, but I could write something that was a poem. These guys wrote something that was a poem. It's a kind of Duchampian idea too, that you can make art out of a urinal or whatever it takes. But that's all 20th century stuff. It's Picasso putting in words in Cuba's paintings.
Right.
So that's not a new thing.
Right.
It's not a new thing. Just like the use of objects in my work, real objects, objet trouvé, is not a new thing either. If you look at Picasso again, with the glass of absinthe, with a real spoon for sugar on each one, I was very moved by that as a boy, because I always thought that you could put anything in a painting. Like you could put red, or you could put a word, or you could put a paintbrush, or you could put a hammer, a real hammer. The hammer was no different than the red, except that the red had a larger field of association, but the hammer has real metaphor.
Right.
So, just that.
How did you find, you said that you found Kenneth Koch, O'Hara, Creeley, those guys. How did you find them? Through bookshops? Or
Yeah,
how
bookshops.
Did it happen?
Bookshops. I was...
in Cincinnati, or?
No, it was
later?
when I first went to New York.
Right.
I was very associated with Oldenburg, Klaus. He and I had a little gallery together where we made performances, and I think in about the late 50s. And he was a very well-educated European. Mm-hmm. His parents were the Swedish consul in Chicago. Mm-hmm. So he grew up in Chicago, but he went to Yale. And he spoke about poetry. And he wrote poetry. And I don't know if he still does, or I never saw anything after those years, but I felt something in the air, and I met, do you know who Ted Jones was? Did you ever hear of him? He was like a black hipster, but he wasn't Miles Davis, and he wasn't Leroy Jones. So he was like a hipster, period. The terrible poems, terrible. But he'd go into cafes and say, "City of Gum." Things like that. And somebody would say, an alto guy would go, and the city of gum. And it was, but then I thought, well, somebody's doing something out there.
Right.
So I started to read about, and then, I know. I read On the Road. I read On the Road in 58 in Athens, Ohio. And that's when I really got into how words could be used in this way. I remember now, yeah.
What did you get out of it?
That there was a rebellious guy who couldn't have given a fuck about academic literature. He had clearly read it all anyway, and found a way to really paint with words.
Wow. And after that...
And also, he used language, and he would say, you know, we know time, man, this kind of stuff in a book, you know, like, we know time, and this kind of thing. And he was like Charlie Parker.
Right. Yeah, there's the talk and also the speed of his...
The speed is
of his
unbelievable.
writing.
The speed was unbelievable.
And when you went to New York, you met Frank O'Hara, for instance, who...
No, I didn't. Those guys never came around us.
Really?
Yeah, it's all mythological that he was so much involved. He was only involved with Dinagi and Tibor's gallery, and also people of his generation, Mike Goldberg, these people, you know, blah, blah, blah. But he also, of course, knew de Kooning and all these people through Larry Rivers. But when he wrote about, there was an article he wrote about the performances that Klaus did, me, and Red Grooms.
Right.
When he wrote about it, that's secondhand. I never saw his face at my performances. I never saw him coming to the Rubin Gallery or to Judson. And I saw him once at a party. The first time I saw him was at a party of photographer Hans Namath, who took the famous pictures of Pollock and things. And I don't know how I got there, but a friend and I went to this party, and he and Norman Bloom, a painter who I couldn't stand, personally or otherwise, and Bergson were there. Bergson was a young man then, you know, and he and O'Hara were together in some way. It's always denied that they consummated anything, which is bullshit, I'm sure. But they were just acting up, and Bergson as a sycophant. And I observed all this at this party, you know. And that's the first time I saw him. The next time I saw him, I think, was at my house. Larry brought him to my house in the country for dinner. And that was in the year before he died. So I really had no association with him. With his poems, I did. But I knew John a little bit. I had drinks with him a few times. But I really knew Kenneth, because Kenneth Koch was 10 years older than I was exactly, with the same education. He went to my high school, and he went to the same summer camp I went to, you know. So we had hilarious times talking about it, so about Cincinnati.
The Cincinnati school of poets.
No, it was the Cincinnati Gulag.
And well, it's funny because Kenneth Koch is someone who has a lot of humor in his. There's a lot of humor in his work, and that it's also something that filters through yours as well.
I actually never thought he was so funny.
I didn't know him, but
but I mean, I never thought he was so funny in his poetry.
Really?
When on his memorial reading, Jane Frolicker read something he wrote about. It was a fantasy he had about plans for pieces, art pieces, describing art pieces like 1,000-foot riverboat on the Ohio River. And she broke up. She thought this was so goddamn funny. And there was nothing funny about it. It was kind of, because she was threatened by it as a figurative painter.
Right.
You know, she was threatened by those people that were doing big installations and earthworks and things, and she just broke her up. She was laughing about it. Well, it wasn't funny. It was clever what he did. He was very witty and clever. For instance, Creeley told me that Kenneth said to him once that he said, "You didn't really go to Harvard, did you? Just was that beatnik who hung around Harvard Square, right?" Creeley loved this, loved it, because Kenneth was very literate, very literary, very into education. Both Creeley and he had been in the war. They came back, and Creeley hung out smoking dope in Harvard Square and getting into fights in bars. And Kenneth would never get into a fight in a bar. He would be in a bar drinking and getting drunk and trying to pick up women. That's what it was. And making jokes and laughing at himself,
And in relation to, I'm thinking about Coke in his poem, you know, when the sun tries to go on.
Yeah.
And this idea of trying to go on, or this idea of process in writing, is also something that we find in your work. When one has the impression of, we're also talking about voice, but on what one has the impression of you know, not eavesdropping on a conversation, but receiving a conversation, or
With myself often.
right. And I was wondering, in you know, we were talking about reading poetry. What would be the I mean, do you feel that there's a tradition of writing that you're a part of, that you come out of, or what would be your
I know what you mean.
pantheon of writing?
But I mean, I don't think I come out of those guys.
Right, sure.
And I certainly don't come out of Ron.
Right.
Certainly not.
Right.
Or anybody else. But Bergen was very complimentary to my early poems,
Right.
and wrote me wonderful letters about it. And I was very, very interested in what he did with the sonnets, the way he moved around this material and kept it, repeating it, but redigesting it all the time. And and Bob, the way he wrote, the sense of melancholy and loss really appealed to me. There's a lot of poets I love, but I really went in rereading my poems because of the book, of Kyle's book, or the collected poems of mine. I realized that I was dropped here as a poet from, I don't know where, you know, from my life experience.
Right.
I was always, as a child, aware of everything. And I think that's what the poems are about finding, trying to find art in the human comedy.
Right. That's really interesting. You know, talking about the human comedy and this mix between levity and seriousness, or you know, this goofy sense of mourning that you know.
Right.
And so I think that's beautiful, the way in which you managed to hold both ends of the spectrum.
Well, for instance, speaking of that title, that came to me when I was photographing one summer. I wrote, it just came to me with a piece of chalk on a fence, this goofy life of constant mourning. And I thought, where did this come from? I mean, this goofy, but I thought it softened the pathos of the line, rather than saying this life of constant mourning, which is too much. By saying this goofy life of constant mourning, made it what life is like. Instead of sitting in your room with your face to the wall every day, you get up and act. You go forward, as Creeley said.
Yeah.
You know, onward.
Not stopping.
I know someone here who speaks French, but she speaks English too, a bit. And she always speaks about, she said, we go and we go. You know, we go and we go. And I always say to her, you know, we go and we go. And it's usually about what she thinks of my painting or what I think of her painting. So we go and we go.
It's funny. We were talking about, you know, the writers that you were interested in. I mean, when I read your work, I mean, I immediately thought of O'Hara for one specific reason, because of the talk quality. Talk. And when I'm reading you, we were talking about voice, and now that we've known each other for a while, when I read you, I can hear your voice, and it's quite fascinating. So how do you relate to talk? Is it when you write?
How do I relate to talk? That's what I'm writing down.
Yeah.
I'm talking in my head.
Right.
And my method is to write the poem, or write a bit of the poem, then to go back and correct. It's collage method.
Right.
It's how I draw. I use an eraser, and I continually erase and add. It's always subtraction and addition, and subtraction and addition. And it's the same with finding a word. And sometimes I'll see that I wrote a word, and I see it as another word, so I try that other word in there, and I usually am right. I get rid of the word I originally intended, you know.
How do you decide on line breaks? I mean, that I'm quite fascinated by. The fact that...
Often, I decide on line breaks visually, how it looks on the page. And if it doesn't make any sense, well then too bad. If you read it, it will make sense most of the time. Most of the time. Sometimes I'm not clear about what it means. It's just that it looks great on the page.
That's great. And do you sometimes play with line breaks for, you know, the possibilities of interruption, of suspension, of stopping, or is it just purely visual?
No, I use it to control the interpretation of the line sometimes.
Right.
Or I'll take it and make it absurd in a way.
Right.
Because I find that amusing.
Right.
I mean, it tickles me to do it.
Right.
It's like my secret trick, you know?
Yeah.
It's like this, if I had a coin and then somebody pulls it out of your ear. That's why sometimes line breaks are like that for me.
That's great. It's thinking about your poems. How do you see, I mean, Vincent Katz in his introduction says that there's been an evolution of your work from the early poems to the more recent work, and he's remarking that your poems have become more disjunctive in a way. But I'm interested in the disjunction of your later poems, the fact that sometimes words collide in a way that is really interesting because it almost becomes visual as well.
In the later poems, they collide a lot because I'm more confident that I can put almost anything together with something else and make it work. And that's the way my method of painting too.
Yeah, that's what I've just found, what Vincent was saying. He sees an evolution in your work from the language of common speech of the early years to a poetry where more things are left out, where more space is introduced between words, more possibilities for disjunction. And I thought that was really interesting because when he says more things are left out, it reminded me of Ashbery's line in The Skaters about what he calls this leaving out business. And you were talking about erasure, you know, erasing things out of the poem. How does that work when you write? Or do you
I take it out.
Right.
It doesn't happen automatically.
Right.
It's reduction
Right.
on my part
Right.
when it isn't necessary.
Right.
There's sometimes things that I've put in that because I've been seduced by the language, that I have to take out.
Right.
It becomes too much.
Wow.
And isn't necessary
Yeah.
for the complete poem. I've learned this from painting. I don't keep beautiful passages for the sake of showing my muscles, you know.
Right.
I'm not flexing here.
You were talking about the complete poem. Sometimes you work on poems over a long period of time, not took quite some
Quite a
time to
long
write.
time.
How do you know when a poem is finished?
Usually, when I can't add to it anymore, or feel that it says what I wanted it to say, and often I say the same thing about painting, when I grow tired,
Right.
you know.
And you...
By that I mean when I grow tired, here.
Right.
Yeah, not physically tired.
Right.
I mean, writing a poem doesn't tire me out.
Have you felt, when you were preparing the volume, the collected poems volume, have you felt the need to, or the desire to...
Change?
Yeah.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Oh yeah. It's the same with my painting. You know, I had a show at the Guggenheim Museum about 15 years ago, and they had to control me because I had all kind of colors in my pocket, and people had lent paintings, and I had changed them. You know, I never got back. No one. There was some things that they had to bring to the restorer after the show was over. So this is not the work that I sent. You know. No. I figure I made it. I can change it.
Right. Well, in that sense, it's very much in keeping. You have this beautiful expression when you're talking about some of your prints, and you're saying that they're collaborations with yourself. So that's in keeping with the self is changing, and therefore
Right.
the collaboration
So yeah,
is...
I'm different than when I wrote a lot of those poems.
Right. And I was wondering, keeping in mind that idea of collaboration with yourself, which I guess can be applied both to your paintings and to your poetry, does the self for you move differently within the activity of painting and within the activity of writing? Or in other words, what is a self-portrait in writing? I mean, you've just had a major show, and you're having a major show.
At the Albertina.
Right, of self-portraits. What is self-portraiture in writing?
Well, that memoir I wrote about being a little boy when I started to regard my face,
Right.
that's self-portrait, sure. I know it's been said, but everything someone does is self-portrait.
Right.
Because that's what you're doing. You're
Right.
talking about yourself in relationship to the world and to yourself.
Mm-hmm.
In writing, it's not getting the nose right, you know, or putting the eyes where they belong. In writing, it's about finding the appropriate word or expression to give the reader the idea of what you mean, or to take away from the reader, not allow them in, and keep them at bay with a certain curiosity about what does this guy talking about, you know. Both things I think are possible and interesting as a method to express an idea, or to try, dare I say, to make art of words.
Right. Do you feel that sometimes when you're writing, when you're saying I, you need to go against yourself? I mean, is there a sense of struggle against the self, against a form of expression which would be too convenient sometimes? Is there a kind of struggle there happening?
There's a struggle there all the time.
Right.
It doesn't just happen. None of this stuff happens. It cooks in me. You know, I get something down, then it looks like shit. Then I correct, then I think about it. Or I'll be home in bed, and I think to myself, I gotta go home, I gotta come back here. You know, I got stuff I gotta do. It's ridiculous to be sleeping. So it's changing. Everything is changing. And everything does change, you know. I mean, I'm a completely different person than I was 2 years ago. And it is quite noticeable to those who've known me before that I have, the sense of time has taken hold of the back of my neck and has made me aware that I cannot waste it. I cannot waste it. When you're 81, you cannot waste it. You're rolling the dice when you hopefully wake up each day, you know? So that's really made it different for me. I'm much freer with my life, with everything.
Right.
And I insist upon it. And so if it's inconvenient for others, I'm sorry, you know?
Yeah, I wanted to ask you about Aldo Kromelink, which we talked about several times, and I was completely fascinated by what you were saying. You collaborated with him several times, and I know he's someone who's been very important to you, as you were important to him. And so I was wondering if you could tell us about him. And about
Sure. We didn't collaborate just several times. I think it's 100 prints I made with him.
Right.
Over a period from 75 till he retired in I think the late 90s. He retired, which is ridiculous. He should never have retired. I mean, artisans don't retire. It's ridiculous. But he did, but my fascination with my relationship with we became really good friends. But there was always this quality that he knew me and I didn't know him. And but he was a man who taught me about French life and culture. And by culture, I don't mean Flaubert. I mean, where do you get a certain 6mm bolt? Where do you find lead, real lead? Where do you find things that took me to art and métier, little shops that don't exist anymore, where he could find stuff. He taught me about, he would go to a flea market and find one little bit of cast iron something. And this would be the 19th century to him in France. He was an expert on the Industrial Revolution, and he had been a pilot too, an amateur pilot. So he knew about stuff like fixing cars and like everything I don't know anything about. I mean, how to fly an airplane. But and he knew. One of my sons is a musician. And he plays the oboe, and when he was a teenager, he would come here to have his oboes made, and Aldo and he would go because Aldo was fascinated to talk to the guy, and Matthew and Aldo made a friendship. Aldo loved teenage boys. I mean, not in some prurient way, not in a prurient way. He loved remembering himself as a teenager. And he had had this amazingly free teenage life, which was not free, he was a prisoner of. But his father had been a famous playwright between the wars, Belgian playwright, Ferdinand Kromelink. And the three brothers, he and his brothers, lived with the father. The mother had gone off. She was a famous comedian. She'd gone off and they never knew why. And one day she reappeared with a partner. And, you know, it was like this dysfunctional life he had. But he shared that stuff with you, or you got it. And Once again, it was the human comedy, but in a French way. And he had a wonderful wife who was a great friend of mine. So he also taught me so much about the process of etching, of intaglio, of you did it this way, you didn't do it that way, you did it this way, you didn't do it that way, and I always did it the way I wanted to, and we were continually like this. And it was a great, great dance around each other to see who was going to win, but he was never angry with me. And he usually gave in because I was going to do it my way anyway. You know, I was like Sinatra. No, he was amazing, amazing friend.
And he's someone who learned his trade at
Le Courrier.
Le Courrier.
And his father apprenticed him to Le Courrier. His father said to him, "You'll never be good enough as an artist. You need a trade." He was a really terrific draftsman too, but he stopped. The father stopped it, and he became this extraordinary etcher, and eventually went off on his own with taking his brother with him. But the brother knew nothing. Right. But Aldo knew everything, everything. I once asked him how Rembrandt bit a plate. That is a way of using acid on the intaglio through the wax you incise. He said, "Piss, I guess." You know, I said, "Really?" He said, "Yeah, horse piss. Must have been." But he had this kind of answer like this. You know, he's always saying stuff like that. Like that. He didn't find it funny. I mean, then it's a matter of fact.
And there's another person who's been very important to you also as a writer. It's Asa Benveniste.
Yeah.
And Trigram Press. And this is a more general question also about your London years, which have been very important. So could you tell us about...
Well, the summer I got to London with my family, with my then wife and 3 little sons, was 67, summer of 67. And I had this very hipster dealer. It was this junkie, and but he knew everybody. And I had already been busted by the police in absentia by a show I made, which was closed down by the police because people objected to the subject matter, which were cocks and cunts, essentially. And it was closed, it was confiscated, and I was prosecuted under some act from the 19th century that said old soldiers cannot display their wounds to gather alms. And I won. But this guy, Robert Fraser, introduced me to all kinds of people. So one of the things he introduced me, there was this party. Ginsberg was at the party. It was the summer of 67, and there must have been 200 people there at this famous hostess. She was called Panna Grady. She was an American hostess who had taken a house in Regent's Park, Grand House. And I met a guy there called Barry Hall. And Barry Hall was a printer and a typesetter and had been trained as an engraver of type, like wedding announcements and things. And he was about my age and very into dope. And his partner in the business, it was called Goliard Press, was Tom Rayworth, the great British poet. And Rayworth, I don't think was there. Rayworth was never anywhere, you know, because he was so reticent. But Barry was there, and he said, "You got to come out to the shop." They had a little coach house in a close where they had a linotype press. And they set type by hand, and they had printed Olson, and they had printed all sorts of people, including Tom Rayworth. And then through Tom and Barry, I guess, I met Asa Benveniste, this American expatriate poet who had lived in Europe since after the Second World War. Lived in Paris first and had worked on Merlin magazine, and then he moved to London and lived with this woman, and she had a son, and he and the son, the stepson, sort of became partners as printers. The son maybe had gone to trade school. Asa was a poet, And he taught himself to print books. And then he asked me if I'd like to make a book. But he asked me to illustrate Tom Rayworth, Big Green Day. And I might have done another book with them. I mean, for another poet, I don't remember. But it was a very fertile time. There was a man called Stuart Montgomery who had a press. And eventually, Barry Hall was bought by Jonathan Cape, so it was called Cape Goliard. And Ron and I, Paget did the book Mr. and Mrs. Jim and Ron with Cape Goliard, you know. Barry Hall eventually died in Kenya, I think. But he had a very, very sketchy life after that. He left the press, raised horses in Arizona. I'm sure he was importing dope and selling dope. And he was very into drugs. And then he went to Africa and died there. I don't know what he died from. It was under weird circumstances. And I'm sure it was about drugs. But he was fearless in a way. Fearless, very strange. And he had good taste in writers. He was not a writer.
And being in London, away from America, was that important to you as a writer?
Yes. Yeah, it was. I was I was able to be myself. Right. And Ted came, Berrigan, to stay with us one summer, '69, I guess. And this guy, Jim Haynes, had a place called the Arts Lab in Soho. Then it was just a big old warehouse, and people could crash there. And it was the '60s, you know. And he'd hold readings, and he heard Ted was in town. So Ted said, "Come on, Jim, you read with me." I'd never read, and a lot of people were there I knew, including Creedley. He was always in London in the summer. I don't know why, but because he was having a relationship with a woman who eventually walked into the sea, and he was always into things like that. You know, that was part of the subject matter. And after the reading, he said to me, "But you're a poet. I don't get it. You're a poet." You know, he said, "You're a real poet." It's the first time anybody ever said that to me. Well, Ted must have thought that because he asked me to read with him. But that's what really did it for me. Because I knew Bob. I had known Bob. He came and stayed with me in Cornell when I taught for that year, and because he was teaching in Buffalo. And but London was so freeing for me. I didn't know what to paint. It was a confusing time for me. There was all these things happening in the '60s. I wasn't a pop artist. I was a pop artist. I wasn't conceptual. I'd been brought up by Duchamp. I hated Duchamp. You know, all these kind of things. I mean, Rauschenberg had been my hero in art school, and now he was making these silk screens. I hated them, and I loved what he had done in Combines. And Johns had been my friend, and then he turned to my wife, and all this kind of stuff was happening. So great to be in London, away from that shit. And I knew a few painters. I knew a few painters, but not much to talk about. Right. I had a great friend who was a great 12-string guitar player and musicologist and aristocrat. And he had evening, and a lot of money. He married American money. He had a beautiful house in Kensington. And he used to have evenings where Ravi Shankar would come, and with Ali Akbar Khan would come, and Ala Raka, the great tabla player. They would give little evenings. I didn't have this in New York City, I can tell you. You know, it was a fantastic time. You know.
And of course, it's a time when, if I'm remembering correctly, you're kind of stopping writing, right?
No, I was writing like crazy.
Really?
Like crazy through the '60s. I stopped about 71 or 2.
Oh, right. So when were you in London? You were in London?
I was in London I went first in 65, I think, to work on a project called The Toolbox, a silkscreen I'd been commissioned.
Right.
But that was only for 6 weeks, and I just fell in love with the place. I'd never been to Europe. I was 30 years old. And people who were privileged had been to Europe. I was not privileged. My family would have just laughed at it because they had all come from Europe and they didn't want to go back. the pogroms had been too much, you know. So I got to London. It was like I felt so free. And so I went back after I taught at Cornell for a year. So I had a little money in London. The guy owed me money for the toolbox. I had no other money. London was so cheap. It was like Mexico had been, you know, it was like so cheap. And you could live on almost nothing. And I moved freely between the classes, as it were.
Yeah, it
was inspiring.
The mid-70s that you stopped writing.
I stopped writing because I thought to myself, you're not a poet, you're a painter, you should get down to it. So I spent those years, I moved to Vermont and spent the winters and the summers working on drawing, trying to become a better draftsman. And I'd maybe make 100, 200 drawings a year and end up with 10. I would erase and build on it and keep on going. And when I eventually came back to writing, in the early 90s, I was having a relationship with another woman other than my wife, and it was very important for me to talk about my feelings, not my necessarily romantic feelings, but to redefine what was infatuation, what is love, what is obsessiveness, obsessive behavior. I wanted to speak all about that, but I also wanted to speak about being human. And my marriage was in trouble anyway, whatever they call that. And the other woman was very inspiring it was Diana. It was very inspiring to me, and inspiring in not about my painting necessarily, but about, I was inspired by her photography, enough to become eventually a photographer in some way. But she inspired me to write the poems. And I had another voice to listen to, you know. And she spoke about another culture that I didn't know about. Just that. Did that answer?